Hi folks, my name is Adam and I like to make tiny nerdy things, and this weekend is Easter. So in honor of the second most important chocolate hiding bunny related holiday, I thought I'd make a little something. Of course, if you're watching this video, then you probably saw the thumbnail, so you might be wondering, why? Well, we were visiting some friends recently, and they have a big book of European folklore which is chocked full of uber weird, horrifying versions of otherwise delightful holiday characters, and it got me thinking, what would the Scandinavian version of the Easter Bunny look like? After a brief moment of reflection, I decided it would probably look like a were-rabbit with a terrible case of mange. To make my mangy were-rabbit, I built a long-limbed aluminium body and wrapped it in foil, then bent it into an appropriately creepy pose so that I could start building up the body with a thin layer of clay. For the time being, I'm really only interested in getting the clay on the body and covering up the majority of the exposed wire and foil. I'm imagining a sickly, thin-limbed monstrosity of a Beaster bunny, so I'm going to keep the clay on the limbs to a minimum. Easter's not known for music and the bunny's not going to be singing, so I'll press his diaphragm up into his chest to highlight his creepy ribs before getting to work highlighting his creepy ribs. This mostly involves pushing the clay around until I've got some lumpy bits on each side, then I can add a thick blob of clay to his sternum. Then it's just a case of blending it in and exaggerating the gaps between the ribs before flipping him over and making his back ribs plenty visible as well. Easter Bunny back ribs are both delicious and an excellent way to really highlight the hunched over creepiness of the pose. Finally, what's a good creepy bent over pose without an overly exaggerated spinal column poking through the skin? I'll start with a long skinny wormy dealy stuck from the tip to the tail, then I can blend it into the back and start to mark out each spinal column before gently rolling the shape of each disc. I'm imagining mid-noughties Madonna arms for my bunny, so I'll wrap the remaining wire in a barely there amount of clay before building up some tiny but extremely strong ropey muscles. I'll do the same thing for the legs, but trying to keep the anatomy mostly humanoid with really exaggerated musculature. Basically, I want them to look like the skin is paper thin. Finally, with the majority of the clay built up and the musculature in place, I'll come back through with a series of small styluses and silicone shapers to push and pull the clay around to give it a stretched and pulled look. Otherwise, the bunny's going to be holding his weight on 2 legs and an arm, but he's going to be a bit top-heavy with an oversized head, so while I'm sculpting that, I'll support the left arm with a little wrist wrap of wire, then I can start to add some of the oversized veins, kinda wherever I think they'll look the worst. These are just teeny tiny wormy dealies that get stuck onto the model and poked around until they're extra veiny, then I can blend them in. For a little added awfulness, I'll poke some shallow divots in a few strategically chosen spots, then fill them with some little balls of clay, which, once blended in, will be some impromptu pustules. After all, if the bunny's going to be mangy, then he really does need some pustules as well. Last but not least, I can add some wrinkly skin texture by pressing some crinkled up plastic wrap onto the surface, followed by a light brushing with a soft nylon brush. Otherwise, that's the body done, so it can be tossed in the oven to cure, and I can get started on the head. I really had no idea how I was going to make the head, but if I'm leaning into the were-rabbit idea, then I may as well go all in. Of course, I don't know what a were-rabbit looks like, so I figured I should probably start with a simple happy rabbit head and go from there. Once I've got my rabbit head sorta shaped out, stuck to the body and blended in, I can poke some divots for a couple big old bunny eyes, then add a cute little nose and the appropriate bunny smile. Finally, with a somewhat bunny looking face, I can start to ruin it. I'll start by stabbing his mouth with a knife so I can open up his jaw and pull out the insides, that way I can make him extra yelly later. Then I'll carefully chop away the cheeks to make room for rows of future teeth before reshaping the jawline so it's a little bit more bunny-esque. Next, I'll start to thicken up the area around the eyes so he looks a tiny bit more angry and a tiny bit less shocked before adding some little balls to his upper jaw to build out his bunny lips. Then it's on to some basic texturing and wrinkling around the entirety of the face. If my bunny is going to have the body of an emaciated monstrosity, then he needs an adequately wrinkly face to match. I'll poke a couple little breathing holes in the front of his face, then a couple fat worms of clay can get stuck to the inside of his mouth, which I'll then stab with a stylus so I can fit some pre-baked teeth into place around his gums. I'd considered giving him a big pair of traditional bunny teeth, but couldn't figure out a way to make them look appropriate for the were-rabbit design, so instead I stuck with the tried and true big pointy stabber styled teeth. At this point he's looking a bit too much like a naked mole rat, but a couple wires jammed into his head will provide adequate support to add some much needed ears. I'll then blend them into the back of the head before filling the inside with more clay so I can make the veiny ear interior. Now my plan all along was to have the Easter Bunny laying a trap for unsuspecting children with a basket in the middle of a room while he's hanging over the edge like a creepy reverse trapdoor spider. Now, I can't make the room out of foam, then build the rest of the bunny since foam and ovens don't generally mix. Instead, I'm gonna make the shape of the room out of a cardboard box so that I can finish sculpting my bunny's hands and feet. Once I've got the Beaster Bunny positioned properly on my makeshift walls, I can start to build up the clay around the hands and feet, then press it back onto the cardboard frame so I can reshape the added clay until it conforms to the shape of the walls. I'm going to be making the walls out of 1 centimeter thick foam later, so I've doubled up the sides of the box so that I know the hands and feet will fit the future room later. With the feet and hand in place, I can start to add the detail. His right hand will be clutching the side with his fingers reaching up and over, so I'll make some little bit long clay sausages to stick into some predefined finger holes, then I can start to really gnarly them up before stabbing some little pre-baked finger talons into the tips and repositioning the fingers so they look extra creepy. I'll then make the feet in the exact same fashion, except they'll be 4-toed bunny feet with larger toe talons before finally sticking a sad little tail onto his butt. Then I can toss the entire cardboard and bunny contraption into the oven to bake so I can safely pop it off the frame and get to work making his creepy little left hand in the same way I made his creepy little right hand. Finally, as a finishing touch, I'll jam a little tongue into his open gob, and after one last bake, he's finally finished and ready to be painted. I'll start by giving him a nice white primer, which will allow for an easy off-white staining by way of a very thin brownish wash. This will be the base coat that I can start to build the layers on top of. I'm picturing a dirty, yellowish brown, kinda light but not white, fleshy looking skin tone to highlight all the wrinkles and creases. Before I build on the brown base coat though, I'll give the lips and ears a series of pinks, reds, purples, and blues to give them a nice fleshy mouth look. Then I'll crack out my stolen makeup sponge to build up the many layers of my Scandinavian Beaster Bunny skin tones. I'm working my way through progressively lighter flesh tones until I'm only tickling the tips with a nearly white top coat. Once it had all dried, I realized I hadn't washed the sponge very well the last time I used it, so my bunny's got kind of a sickly green cast to it, but given what I'm trying to do here, I think it's kind of a happy accident and it works well. With the skin tones done, I'll repaint the teeth with a bone white base coat followed by a solid white top coat, which then gets a light umber wash that I can dab away before it dries, leaving me with some gnarly looking chompers. I'll then repeat this process for the fingers and toes before painting the eyes with a black to white gradient until I've got a pair of unsettlingly cataracty looking peepers. Otherwise, my Easter Bunny is looking, well, beautiful, but a tad bit naked. Fortunately, I happen to have this perfectly colored static grass just lying around as a result of purchasing it specifically for this project. Now to stick it to my rabbit, I've got just the tool. This is a static grass box which works by, well, some sort of magic I don't fully understand. Basically, you put the grass on top of the box, then flick the little switch on, and it statically charges the grass, launching it up into the air and all over your studio, and directly into your lungs and eyes. However, if you coat a horrifying bunny rabbit in a splotchy layer of PVA glue, you can trick the spirit of the box into attacking the rabbit instead, eventually leaving you with a poorly coated, mangy-looking monstrosity of a sculpture. And because I applied a thin layer of glue and the grass fibers are so long, I'm left with a perfectly pathetic layer of fur. The only thing left to do then is add the ever-important UV resin to the eyes to make them shine real good and add some high-gloss varnish to the mouth. And that's our Easter Bunny finally finished, which means it's time to make his lair. As I mentioned earlier, the room will be built of 1 centimeter thick foam, which I can quickly cut down to size. Once the chopping is finished, I'm left with 3 walls and a floor. I'll then mark out where I want some windows to go, as well as where I should put a door, before deciding I am too lazy to make 3 walls and my floor is too big. So now I'm left with a back wall, a side wall, and a slightly smaller floor ready to get chopped up. I've made a window template, so I know my windows will be the same size, and once I've popped the foam out of the window, I can start marking out the bricks. Now, a standard British brick is 215mm by 102.5mm, and the door frame I've cut is 115mm tall. So to find the proper size for my bricks, it's just a case of finding the scale of the door and applying that to the size of the bricks. On the other hand though, that feels like a lot of math for a diorama that includes an Easter bunny monster, so I'm just gonna make all my bricks 1cm by 2cm and call it a day. Otherwise, once the window wall's been bricked up, I can do the same thing to the back wall. Now, while my walls are well bricked, they're lacking a certain bricky texture to them, so I've made myself a little aluminium ball that I'll use to carefully apply texture. Finally, with the walls bricked and texturized, it's time to prime them with a little black paint and Mod Podge. Once the black Mod Podge is that time to dry, I'll paint all the bricks with a nice bricky red base coat, which gets followed by a series of red and orange dry brushes to help bring out some of the texture and detail. To make the wooden frame around the windows and the doors, I'm going to use some big paint pot stir sticks, but they're a bit too wide, so I'll have to cut them in half, then I can cut them down to fit the frame. The wood's pretty wonky as is, but this is going to be an old dilapidated building, so a bit of fancy knife work will roughen the wood up a bit before I glue them in place. With the frames in place, I can give them a darker stain with some thinned out brown wash, and to make the wood look a little more worn and weathered, I'll go back over the brown with a dirty grey wash. Otherwise, I've now got a beautiful brick wall and some lovely wooden window and door frames, but I want this to be an old worn out building, so I'm gonna plaster over the walls using my favorite non-sponsored material, One Strike Filler. Now, to make it a little bit less blazingly white, I'll mix it up with a tiny bit of stone gray, then I can slap it directly onto my brick wall. I've been using this stuff for years as a basing material or to make snowy things, but I think this might be the first time I've ever used it on a wall. To make it look a little bit more like a worn plaster wall, I'll give it a couple minutes to dry before using a flat silicone shaper to scrape off some sections where the plaster's broken away. Then, once the plaster's fully cured, I can glue the 2 walls to the floor before realizing that I probably should have sanded the walls before attaching them to the base. My original plan was to make the floors out of longer lengths of paint sticks, but after laying a couple boards in place, I decided they were a touch too thick, so instead I'll have to turn to my old friend, stir sticks. Of course, the problem with stir sticks is that they're rounded on the end, so I'll have to snip some tips. Now, I didn't count how many stir sticks I ended up using, but if I had to guess, I'd say it's somewhere near 3 or 4 billion, and cutting each tip square one at a time would be an absolute ball ache. So to save myself a little time, I stacked them together and sawed the tips off in bunches. Then it was just a case of flipping them over.
They ask you how you are, you just have to say that you're fine when you're not really fine.
Then it was just a case of flipping them over, cutting the other end flat, then gluing them in place. With the flooring in place, I can make some wonky baseboard out of some more paint sticks, and then I can make a door out of a big sheet of obèche. Obèche is technically a hardwood, but it's incredibly soft and super easy to shape with nothing more than a knife, so all I did was cut out a rectangle to fit within the dimensions of my door, then I marked out and chopped out the shape of a teeny tiny wooden door. Then I drilled a door handle before taking my pliers to it to break it apart. And for some reason I snapped it in half and immediately regretted it, so I glued it back together and gave it a couple coats of the same stain as the door frame. While the door is drying, I'll break off the longer tips of the floor, then give it a once-over with a lovely reddish-brown stain, followed by that same grayish whitewash so it looks nice and worn. I didn't let the stain dry between coats, so it ended up warping the wood, which was absolutely my intention. Shut up, no questions. I then applied some of that gray whitewashing to the walls to make the plaster look water-damaged and gross. Finally, a quick sanding on the floor will add some nice natural wear and tear to the wood, and I can glue my smashed up door in place. To make some broken windows, I've taken my original window frame template and made some windows out of thin Perspex sheet, which I can carefully break into little broken pieces. Using some foam-safe superglue, I can attach the larger broken pieces to the back side of the wall to make the windows look broken, and the smaller pieces I'll accidentally brush onto the floor of my studio so I can spend the next week picking shards of plexiglass out of the bottoms of my feet. Once the floor is dried, I want to add some dirt and grime, which I can do using some pigment powders. These are just some pastel sticks that I crushed up, and I can use a borrowed makeup brush to apply into the cracks of the floorboards and all over the base to add a bit of dust and natural weathering. One thing to note though, if you accidentally toss it on the wall, don't use the brush to remove it, since you'll only make it worse. Fortunately, I'd been planning to make a shelf to go against the wall anyways, so much like in real life, if you can't clean a stain, just put some kind of furniture over top of it. Having spent a couple days walking around barefoot in my studio, I've now got a large enough collection of tiny Perspex shards that I can scatter around the floor near the window. Finally, to add a touch of color, I'll add some green wash to the walls and along the edge of the shelf, window frames, and door, then scatter some bits of wind-blown leaves and detritus around the broken window. This is, of course, an Easter-themed diorama, so I'll need to make an Easter basket, which I can do by wrapping some twine around the tip of a cardboard tube. Once it's been pushed tight to itself, I'll lock the twine in place with a copious soaking of extra thin CA glue, and once it's cured, I can cut the basket off the tube, attach it to a base of wound twine, then make a teeny tiny handle. Finally, I can glue this into place in the center of my floor, fill it with some rabbit fur, then add my freshly painted Easter eggs. Originally, I was ready to call it done here, but one of my patrons asked if I'd put a painting of my tooth fairy on the wall above the shelf, and I was more than happy to oblige, so I printed out a teeny tiny photo of him, cut it out, then dirtied it up with a few coats of the water from my brush washing cup. A bit of PVA glue will hold him in place on the wall, and I can rough up the edges a bit so it looks well worn like the rest of the room. Finally, I can attach my Easter bunny to the corner of the room where he awaits his greedy little prey, and with that, I think it's safe to say that this isn't just Good Friday, it's good enough Friday. As always, a big thank you to the fine folk over on Patreon who help to keep this channel churning out terrible ideas week after week, except for the weeks when I don't. And a big thank you to my newest patrons, Alicia Evans, Dr. Mrs. The Meerman, Allie, Sarah Jameson, Joel Dallison, Cerise DeNova, Steph Rude, Haley Baggett, Kristonite Conine, Tiff Flynn, Joey Wolf, Ryan Olshavsky, Amanda Weaver, Coven, Blunt Force Llama, and Burgle. You are the patchy hair that keeps this Easter bunny of a channel moderately warm during the slightly chilly April evenings. As always, make sure to like that egg button and Easter the subscription bunny. Otherwise, we'll see you next time. Cheers.